April 1945, a dirt road outside Lüneburg, northern Germany. The rain has stopped, but the ground still swallows boots with every step. A British sergeant stands at the roadside, rifle slung low, watching a column approach through the mist. They are women, 30, maybe 40 of them. No uniforms now, just torn coats, muddy skirts, faces turned downward. Some hold scarves over their heads. Others press their hands to their cheeks, hiding. They do not speak. The sergeant has seen surrender before. He has watched men throw down their weapons and weep. He has accepted the raised hands of boys too young to shave. But this is different. One woman glances up. Her eyes meet his for half a second. Wide, hollow, afraid. Then she looks away, pulling her scarf tighter. The sergeant does not shout. He does not move. He simply nods. Not in greeting. Not in forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. The column shuffles past. The war is ending. But something about this moment will not leave him. These women were not victims. They were part of the machine. And yet, standing here in the mud, they looked as broken as everyone else. They were called Blitzmädchen, lightning girls. The term was informal, affectionate even, used to describe the hundreds of thousands of German women who served in auxiliary roles for the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS throughout World War II. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They did not carry rifles into battle, but they were essential to the Nazi war machine. By 1944, over 500,000 German women had been recruited into military support roles. They operated switchboards, plotted aircraft movements on maps, decoded signals, typed orders, managed supply depots. They worked in uniform, under military discipline, often closer to the front lines than anyone expected. Some volunteered out of patriotism. Others were pressured by the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the Nazi Girls' League, which groomed young women from adolescence to serve the fatherland. The propaganda was powerful. Your brothers fight. You must serve. And some did more than serve. In concentration camps, women worked as guards. At Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz-Birkenau, they supervised prisoners, enforced labor quotas, participated in selections. Some were brutal, others simply obeyed. The line between complicity and cruelty was thin, and history would struggle to draw it cleanly. By 1945, as the Reich collapsed, these women found themselves in an impossible position. The Allies were closing in from all sides. Soviet forces swept westward with vengeance in their hearts. British and American troops advanced through Germany, liberating camps, uncovering horrors. And the women who had worn Nazi insignia, whether as clerks, radio operators, or camp guards, suddenly became targets. Some fled in civilian clothes. Others were captured in uniform, clutching false papers. Many tried to blend into refugee columns, hoping anonymity would save them. But their accents gave them away. Their hands, soft from office work, revealed they were not farmers. And their fear, sharp, unmistakable, made soldiers ask questions. The Allies had rules. Prisoners of war were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. But these women occupied a gray zone. Were they combatants? Were they criminals? Were they victims of propaganda or architects of atrocity? The answer depended on who captured them. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was a corpse still twitching. The Third Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, had shrunk to a few hundred square miles. Berlin was surrounded. The Führer huddled in a bunker beneath the Chancellery. issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed. In the West, British and American forces pushed deeper into the heartland. In the East, the Red Army unleashed a fury born of 4 years of devastation. The collapse was not clean. It was chaotic, brutal, and soaked in desperation. Millions of Germans fled westward, away from the Soviets. Entire cities emptied overnight. Refugees clogged the roads, women, children, elderly men pulling carts. Among them moved fragments of the Wehrmacht, SS units in retreat, and scattered auxiliaries who had abandoned their posts. The military structure dissolved. Rank meant nothing. Survival was the only mission left. Allied soldiers who entered German towns in those final weeks encountered a population caught between defiance and terror. Some waved white flags from windows. Others set ambushes with Panzerfausts, dying for a regime already dead. And everywhere there were prisoners. The Western Allies took millions. By May 1945, over 7 million German POWs were in British, American, and French custody. Most were men, exhausted, hungry, relieved to be out of the fight. But among them were women, thousands of them. When British and American troops liberated concentration camps, they found female guards. At Bergen-Belsen, the British arrested SS Aufseherinnen, women who had overseen prisoners with whips and dogs. At Ravensbrück, Soviet and Allied forces captured dozens more. Their crimes were documented. Survivors pointed them out. There was no ambiguity, but what about the others? The radio operators, the clerks, the young women who had plotted bomber routes or filed reports. They had not pulled triggers. They had not beaten prisoners. Yet they had served. They had enabled. And now, as they stood in surrender columns with covered faces, soldiers had to decide. What kind of enemy were they? The sergeant at Lüneburg was not the first to face this question. He would not be the last. But his nod, silent, weary, human, captured something the history books would struggle to explain. War had made monsters of men. It had also made soldiers ask impossible questions about guilt, complicity, and mercy. And in the mud of a German road, one man chose restraint over rage. The women's perspective. They knew what was coming. The women in that column had heard the stories. Whispers traveled faster than armies in the spring of 1945. What the Soviets did to German women in the East. What happened to SS guards when camp survivors recognized them? What Allied soldiers said when they found the ovens still warm. So they covered their faces. Not out of shame alone. Though shame was there, heavy and suffocating. They covered their faces because exposure meant identification. Identification meant accusation. And accusation, in those final days, could mean a bullet in a ditch. For some, the fear was justified. Women who had worked as guards at concentration camps knew they were marked. Irma Gracie, the hyena of Auschwitz, would be hanged by the British before the year ended. Ilse Koch, the witch of Buchenwald, faced trial for crimes too grotesque to be believed at first. Dozens of others were executed or imprisoned. Their crimes were real, documented, undeniable. But not all the women in that column were guards. Some had been clerks. 19-year-old girls who typed requisition forms and never saw a camp. Radio operators who relayed weather reports and believed they were serving Germany, not genocide. Nurses who tended wounded soldiers and never asked where the orders came from. They had worn the uniform. They had raised their arms in salute. They had believed, or at least, they had not questioned. And now, As the world they knew disintegrated, they faced a reckoning they did not understand how to navigate. In captivity, they would be sorted. British and American forces separated women by role and rank. Those identified as camp personnel were held for trial. Others were processed as regular POWs, sent to camps where they slept in tents, ate thin soup, and waited for a future no one could promise. Some tried to lie. They discarded badges, burned papers, claimed they had only cooked or cleaned. But survivors had long memories. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated prisoners walked through lines of female POWs, pointing. That one, and her. Yes, her too. The women who were identified wept. Some protested. I only followed orders. I had no choice. The soldiers who guarded them had heard those words before. From men, from officers, from everyone who had ever worn the swastika. But hearing it from women was different. Not because women were incapable of cruelty. The camps proved otherwise. But because society, even in war, struggled to reconcile femininity with atrocity. Women were supposed to be mothers, nurses, victims, not perpetrators, yet here they were, heads bowed, faces hidden, waiting for judgment. And in that moment, they were neither heroes nor villains. They were people who had made choices, some monstrous, some mundane, and now stood at the end of a road with nowhere left to run. The sergeant saw that. He saw the fear. He saw the exhaustion. He saw human beings stripped of everything except the weight of what they had been part of. And he nodded. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because hatred in that moment felt too heavy to carry. The soldier's perspective. The sergeant had been at war for 5 years. He had landed in Normandy on D-Day +3, waded through bocage hedgerows where every field was a killing ground. He had fought through France, Belgium, the Netherlands. He had seen friends cut down by machine gun fire, blown apart by mines, burned alive in tanks. He had learned to hate efficiently. Hate kept you sharp. Hate made you pull the trigger without hesitation. Hate was fuel when exhaustion threatened to collapse you in a foxhole. But hate also required energy. And by April 1945, he had none left. The day before encountering the women's column, his unit had liberated a satellite camp near Neuengamme. The images were scorched into his mind. Skeletal figures in striped rags, staring with hollow eyes, bodies stacked like cordwood. The smell, God, the smell, that clung to his uniform no matter how hard he scrubbed. The guards had fled. The prisoners could barely speak. One old man grabbed the sergeant's hand and wept, kissing it, whispering words in a language he didn't understand. That night, the sergeant couldn't eat. He sat alone, smoking cigarettes until his throat burned, trying to reconcile what he had seen with the world he thought he knew. When the women's column appeared the next day, his first instinct was rage. These women had worn the same uniform as the guards who fled. They had served the same regime that built those camps. Some of them, maybe the one looking at him right now, might have typed the orders, filed the reports, turned the keys. He could have shouted. He could have made them stand in the rain, hands behind their heads, faces exposed for all to see. He could have let his anger speak, but anger felt futile. Shooting them wouldn't bring back the dead. Humiliating them wouldn't undo the years of mechanized horror. The war was ending. The Nazis had lost. These women, whether they deserved pity or punishment, were finished. So he nodded. It was not a gesture of absolution. It was acknowledgement of a shared exhaustion. He was tired of death, tired of cruelty, tired of the moral calculations war forced upon him every single day. Other soldiers might have acted differently. Some did. In the chaos of April 1945, vengeance was common. Soviet troops, having endured unimaginable suffering, showed little mercy to German women, combatant or not. Some American and British units also engaged in acts of retribution, though official policy condemned it. But this sergeant, on this road, chose silence. He had seen enough. He had killed enough. He had lost enough. The women shuffled past. One whispered something to another. A third stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. They disappeared into the mist, toward prisoner cages and uncertain fates. The sergeant lit another cigarette. His hands were steady. His conscience was not at peace. Peace was a luxury for people who hadn't seen what he'd seen. But he had made a choice to treat the enemy as human, even when humanity felt like a lie. To let exhaustion speak louder than hate. To nod, not in forgiveness, but in recognition that this war had broken everyone it touched. And perhaps that was all that remained. The acknowledgement that victors and vanquished alike were now walking through ruins, trying to remember what it meant to be more than machines of violence. The moment lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. The woman with the scarf pulled tight around her face stopped walking. The column continued to shuffle forward, but she remained still, caught between the impulse to move and the weight of what she was about to face. Her hands trembled at the edges of the fabric. Her eyes, pale blue, red-rimmed from crying or sleeplessness, fixed on the sergeant. She was young, 22, maybe 23, old enough to have served for years, young enough to have believed every word they told her. The sergeant met her gaze. For a moment, the war disappeared. There was no column of prisoners, no liberated camp behind them, no shattered Germany stretching in every direction. Just 2 people standing on a muddy road, carrying weights neither could articulate. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. What could she say? I'm sorry? Sorry for what? For losing or for participating? I didn't know. But ignorance was no longer a defense, not after the world had seen what the camps contained. I had no choice? Every soldier says that. Every bureaucrat, every person who ever enabled atrocity while telling themselves they were powerless. So she said nothing. Her hand dropped from the scarf, letting it slip just enough to reveal her full face. It was an act of surrender more complete than raising her hands had been. She was allowing herself to be seen, to be identified, to be judged. The sergeant saw the fear in her expression, but he also saw something else, resignation. She knew. Whatever happened next, interrogation, trial, imprisonment, execution, she knew she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The Germany she had served no longer existed. The future she had imagined was ash, and the person she had been, the girl who had believed in flags and speeches and the righteousness of her cause, was gone. The sergeant shifted his weight. His rifle hung loose at his side. He could have barked an order, could have demanded her name, her unit, her role, standard procedure, by-the-book processing of enemy personnel. But the book felt irrelevant now. He had read the reports. He had walked through the evidence. He knew what the Nazi regime had done, what apparatus had been required to do it. And he knew that this woman, whether she had pulled a trigger or filed a form, had been part of that apparatus. She deserved to be held accountable. They all did. But standing here, looking at her face, exhausted, terrified, human, he found himself unable to summon the rage that had fueled him for so long. so he nodded. A single, slight movement of his head. Barely perceptible. Not a gesture of approval. Not forgiveness. Not even pity. Just acknowledgement. I see you. I see what you are. I see what we both are now. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She had expected shouting, expected violence. The stories from the Eastern Front were clear about what happened to captured German women. Even in the West, retribution was common. Soldiers who had seen the camps rarely showed mercy. But this soldier simply nodded. And then he stepped aside. The gesture was small, but it released her from the frozen moment. She pulled the scarf back over her face, turned, and rejoined the column. Her steps were unsteady. She did not look back. The other women followed. One by one they passed the sergeant. Some kept their heads down. Others glanced at him briefly, searching for clues about what awaited them. He watched them all with the same weary expression. Behind him, a corporal approached. Young, American, his face still held anger. "Sarge, you want us to separate them? Check for process them standard," the sergeant said quietly. "Anyone identified as camp staff gets flagged. The rest go to holding." "That's it?" The sergeant turned to look at his subordinate. The corporal was 19. He had been in combat for 3 months. He still believed in clean lines between good and evil. "That's it," the sergeant said. The corporal hesitated, then nodded and walked away. The column disappeared down the road toward the prisoner processing center. The sergeant remained at the roadside, lighting another cigarette with hands that had stopped shaking years ago. The war was ending. Justice would come. Trials, sentences, reckonings. History would sort the guilty from the complicit, the monsters from the machinery. But in that moment, on that road, the sergeant had made a choice that would haunt him differently than the killing had. He had chosen to see the enemy as human. And somehow, that felt heavier than anything he had carried before. The women disappeared into a system unprepared for them. By May 1945, the Allies held over 7 million German prisoners of war. The camps hastily constructed to house them stretched across occupied Germany, fenced enclosures with tents, minimal sanitation, and rations barely sufficient to sustain life. They were called Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps, and conditions were grim. But male POWs, at least, fit within established military frameworks. They were processed, categorized, and held according to Geneva Convention. Protocols, however imperfectly enforced. Female prisoners existed in a more ambiguous space. Women, identified as concentration camp guards, faced immediate military tribunals. At Bergen-Belsen, the British charged 45 personnel with war crimes. 11 were women. Irma Gracie, 22 years old, stood trial for atrocities committed at Auschwitz and Belsen. Witnesses described her beating prisoners with a whip, setting dogs on them, participating in selections for the gas chambers. She showed no remorse. During interrogation, she claimed she had only followed orders. At trial, she appeared detached, sometimes bored. On December 13, 1945, she was hanged. She was the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. Others followed. Juana Bormann, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Maria Mandl, all convicted, all executed. Their crimes were documented, their guilt established beyond doubt. But what about the thousands of other women? The auxiliaries who had served in offices, communication centers, supply depots. They had worn uniforms. They had taken oaths. They had enabled the machinery of war. Were they prisoners of war? Criminals? Displaced persons? The answer varied by captor and circumstance. In British and American zones, Most non-guard female auxiliaries were processed as standard POWs. They were held in segregated camps, interrogated, then gradually released over the following months. Many returned to destroyed cities, searching for families that no longer existed. In the Soviet zone, justice was harsher and less discriminating. The Red Army made little distinction between combatants and collaborators. German women, military or civilian, faced mass deportations to labor camps in the Soviet Union. Tens of thousands disappeared into the Gulag system. Some returned years later. Many never did. The woman with the pale blue eyes, the one who had locked gazes with the sergeant, likely ended up in a British camp. She would have been questioned, her role verified. If she had worked in a benign capacity, typing, filing, communications, she would eventually have been released. But release did not mean Freedom. Germany in 1945 was a landscape of rubble and ghosts. The women who returned from captivity found cities unrecognizable. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin. Entire districts reduced to skeletal frames and ash. Families were scattered or dead. Homes were occupied by refugees or simply gone, and they carried a stain that would not wash away. In the immediate post-war years, German society grappled with collective guilt in ways both profound and dishonest. The phrase Stunde Null, 0 hour, suggested a clean break, a new beginning. But memory does not reset. Complicity does not evaporate. For women who had served the Nazi regime, reintegration was complicated by shame and silence. Many never spoke of their wartime roles. They buried their uniforms, destroyed photographs, invented new histories. In a nation desperate to forget, they found willing amnesia everywhere. Some married, raised children, became schoolteachers, nurses, shopkeepers. The war became a chapter they refused to open, even to themselves. Others could not escape. Women identified publicly as former guards or SS auxiliaries faced social ostracism. Neighbors whispered. Employers refused to hire them. Some were attacked. A few committed suicide. The psychological toll on both sides proved difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. The sergeant who had nodded on that muddy road returned to England in the summer of 1945. He was demobilized, given a small pension, and expected to resume normal life. But normal no longer existed. He had nightmares. Not of combat, though those haunted him too, but of the camps, of the faces, of the woman with the scarf, and the question her eyes had asked, "What am I now?" He never told his family what he had seen. His wife knew he had changed, quieter, distant, prone to long silences. But thousands of veterans returned the same way. The war had broken something in them that peace could not repair. In 1953, he attended a veterans' reunion. Over drinks, an old comrade mentioned the German POWs. "Remember those women?" The man laughed darkly, covered their faces like they thought we wouldn't. The sergeant stood and left. He never attended another reunion. Decades later, historians would interview veterans about the final days of the war. Most spoke of liberation, victory, relief. Few mentioned the moral complexity of occupation. Fewer still discussed the moment when enemy became human, when rage gave way to exhaustion, when the only response left was a silent nod. The sergeant died in 1982. He left no memoir, no testimony, just a daughter who remembered him staring out windows, smoking, lost in memories he would not share. And somewhere in Germany, perhaps an old woman also stared out windows, carrying her own unbearable weight. They never saw each other again, but that moment on the road connected them permanently. Two people who had glimpsed the wreckage war makes of everyone, victors and vanquished alike. War does not end when the guns fall silent. It lingers in the eyes of those who survived. It echoes in the choices made when mercy and justice stood on opposite sides of a muddy road. It lives in the unspoken weight carried by a sergeant who nodded instead of shouted, and a woman who uncovered her face instead of running. The story of German women prisoners of war is not a story of innocence. Many were complicit. Some were monstrous. The machinery of genocide required millions of hands, and those hands were not all male. To romanticize their suffering or excuse their participation would be to dishonor the victims of the camps, the prisoners who died, the world that burned. But it is also not a story with easy villains. Ideology is a virus that spreads through nations, infecting the young, the desperate, the ambitious, and the naive. Nazi Germany did not appear overnight. It was built by millions of individual decisions to believe, to obey, to look away, to participate. The women in that column had made those decisions, and in April 1945, they stood at the end of the road those decisions had paved. The sergeant's nod was not forgiveness. Forgiveness requires understanding, and he did not understand how ordinary people could enable such extraordinary evil. His nod was not mercy either in any redemptive sense. Mercy implies grace, and he had none left to give. What the nod represented was simpler and more difficult. Recognition. Recognition that the person standing before him, however guilty, was still a person. That hatred, justified as it was, could not be sustained indefinitely without destroying the one who carried it. That justice would come through courts and sentences, not through roadside rage, and perhaps, most painfully, recognition that war had turned everyone, perpetrator and liberator alike, into something less than they had been. The camps were liberated. The trials were held. The guilty were punished, though never enough, never proportionally to the scale of suffering inflicted. History recorded the crimes, assigned the blame, built the memorials, but history struggles with moments like the one on that road. It cannot categorize a nod. It cannot file away the complicated truth that soldiers who had every right to hate sometimes chose not to. That women who served evil were not always monsters, even when their service enabled monstrous things. That the end of war brings not clarity, but a haunting fog where nothing is as simple as it should be. The woman with the pale blue eyes, whoever she was, whatever she had done, carried her past until the day she died. So did the sergeant. Neither found peace. Neither deserved to. Peace is not the reward for surviving atrocity. It is the luxury of those who never had to choose between rage and restraint on a muddy road in a collapsing empire. What remains is memory. Memory of the camps. Memory of the victims. Memory of the mechanisms that turned a nation into a death machine. But also memory of a moment when exhaustion spoke louder than hate, when a soldier chose recognition over retribution, when humanity, fractured, compromised, barely recognizable, flickered in the space between captor and captive. The war ended. The trials concluded. The survivors aged and died. But that nod endures. Not as a symbol of forgiveness, but as a testament to the unbearable complexity of being human in the aftermath of inhumanity.